A former pit boss just shared something casinos have been trying to keep quiet for years, and what he revealed could save you thousands of dollars the next time you walk onto a casino floor. His name was Marcus, and he spent 12 years managing table games at three major Las Vegas properties before he quit in 2022. According to Marcus and eight other former casino employees we spoke with, there are specific tactics that smart players use to minimize their losses. Tactics that casino management not only discourages but actively trains their staff to identify and counteract. These aren't systems to beat the house or guarantee wins. The mathematics don't work that way, and every former employee we spoke with was crystal clear about that. But what these insiders revealed is that certain behaviors, certain approaches to gambling, consistently resulted in players losing significantly less money than the average casino visitor. In fact, according to internal reports that former employees described, casinos have changed entire policies, restructured their comp systems, and retrained thousands of staff members specifically to counter these nine tactics. Some of what you're about to hear might surprise you, some of it might seem obvious once you hear it, but according to these former insiders, fewer than 5% of players actually use these approaches. And that's exactly what casinos are counting on. Now, before we get into the specific tactics, it's important to understand something that former employees emphasized repeatedly. These strategies don't change the house edge. The mathematical advantage the casino holds on every game remains exactly the same, whether you use these tactics or not. What changes, according to these former workers, is how much exposure you have to that edge, how much time that advantage has to work against your bankroll. Think of it this way, as one former slot technician explained it. The house edge is like a slow leak in your tire, and these tactics limit how long you're driving on it. Casino profit models, according to former management employees, are built on volume and duration. They expect players to gamble for extended periods, to return frequently, to make decisions based on emotion rather than planning. The tactics you're about to hear represent exactly the opposite approach, and that's precisely why casinos have spent considerable resources trying to discourage them. Let's start with tactic number one, the time limit strategy. Former slot attendants report that casinos genuinely hate when players set strict, predetermined time limits and actually stick to them. According to internal training documents that former employees described, floor managers at major casino chains are specifically taught to identify players using phone timers or alarms. Here's why this matters. The psychological concept that casinos profit from is called time on device, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The longer you sit at a machine or a table, the more hands you play, the more spins you make, the more opportunity the house edge has to extract money from your bankroll. It's pure mathematics. Even on games with relatively low house edges, extended play almost always results in losses approaching the expected theoretical amount. According to former employees, casinos track average time on device for every machine and every table game. They know, based on years of data, approximately how long the average player stays. And smart players, the ones who use this first tactic, deliberately stay well under those averages. Former slot attendants report that disciplined players typically set sessions of 45 minutes or less. Here's a specific case that multiple former employees from the same property remembered. Her name was Michelle, and she visited a tribal casino in Connecticut approximately twice a month for over 3 years. What made Michelle notable to staff wasn't that she won or lost any particular amount. It was her behavior pattern. Michelle would arrive, play slot machines for exactly 30 minutes, and leave. Former attendants report that she would set a visible timer on her phone, place it next to the machine, and when that timer rang, she would cash out regardless of whether she was winning or losing. One former attendant described watching Michelle cash out while she was up about $200, and another remembered seeing her leave after losing roughly the same amount. The critical element, according to these former workers, was that Michelle's behavior never changed based on outcomes. The 30-minute limit was absolute. Now here's where it gets really interesting. According to former floor managers, casino management doesn't just notice this behavior. They actively strategize around it. Training materials that former employees described include specific instructions for handling players who exhibit time limit discipline. The countermeasures are sophisticated. First, casinos removed visible clocks from gaming floors decades ago, and windows are deliberately minimal or non existent in most modern casino designs. But according to former employees, that's just the beginning. Floor managers are reportedly taught to track players who use timers and coordinate with cocktail servers and hosts to offer specific inducements right before common alarm times. If a player consistently uses a 45-minute timer, staff members are trained to appear around the 40-minute mark with offers, a complimentary meal, tournament entry, show tickets, anything to interrupt the departure pattern. One former floor manager described this explicitly. The goal was never to be obvious about it, but to create what he called soft obstacles to leaving. An offer delivered at just the right moment, a friendly conversation that extends a few minutes past the alarm, a suggestion about a hot machine that just paid out in another section. According to this former manager, even adding 5 or 10 minutes to a disciplined player's session, multiplied across hundreds of visits, represented significant additional revenue. But here's what former employees say made Michelle's approach so effective, and why it reportedly saved her from the kind of losses casinos depend on. She had a departure ritual. The moment her timer rang, she would immediately press the cash out button, take her ticket, and walk directly to the cage. No browsing other machines, no stops at different games, no conversations with staff beyond basic courtesy. Former employees report that this immediate mechanical departure pattern was almost impossible to interrupt. And the mathematics, according to their observations, spoke for themselves. While average players at similar denomination machines were losing hundreds of dollars per visit over 3 to 4 hour sessions, Michelle's losses were reportedly minimal, and she apparently had multiple winning sessions simply because 30 minutes wasn't enough time for the house edge to fully assert itself. That's the power of tactic number 1. But time limits are just the beginning. Tactic number 2. The betting pattern that confuses tracking systems. And if you think time limits are smart, wait until you hear about this. Former surveillance operators report that erratic bet sizing, done deliberately and strategically, confuses player tracking algorithms that casinos use to build customer profiles. Now, this requires some explanation about how modern casino tracking actually works. According to former employees who worked in player development and surveillance, every major casino uses your player's card to build an incredibly detailed profile of your gambling behavior. The system tracks your average bet size, your game selection, your win-loss record, how long you play, what time of day you visit, and dozens of other data points. These algorithms are specifically designed to identify high-value players, people who bet consistently at higher levels, because those are the players casinos want to reward with targeted comps and offers. The entire comp system, according to former marketing employees, is built around incentivizing behavior that maximizes casino profit. That means encouraging consistent, predictable, higher-value play. But here's what former surveillance operators discovered. Players who alternate between minimum bets and occasional larger bets in specific patterns generate what insiders describe as confusing data. The algorithm expects consistency. It's built to recognize patterns like always betting $25 per hand, or always playing dollar slots, or always making the same craps bets. When a player deliberately varies their betting in ways that don't follow predictable patterns, the tracking system struggles to assign an accurate average daily theoretical value. According to former employees, the specific ratio that seemed most effective was approximately 10 small bets to 1 larger bet. So a player might make 10 $5 bets, then one $50 bet, then return to $5 bets. The system registers both the small and large wagers, but the overall profile becomes, as one former surveillance employee described it, unpredictable and difficult to categorize. There was a player named Robert who former employees from a Boulder Highway casino remember, specifically because his profile was discussed in multiple team meetings. Robert played blackjack, and according to former pit supervisors, his betting pattern made no apparent sense. He would bet the table minimum for extended periods, then suddenly make a bet 15 or 20 times larger, then return immediately to minimum betting. This wasn't card counting, the timing didn't correlate with the count, and surveillance confirmed this repeatedly. It was just erratic. And here's why that mattered. Casino comp algorithms, according to former player development employees, are designed to reward consistent high-value players. They want to identify people who will reliably generate significant theoretical loss over time. Robert's profile showed unpredictable behavior that made him, from a casino marketing perspective, not worth heavily investing in. He received minimal comp offers, no host contact, and no targeted promotions. And according to former employees familiar with his play, that was exactly what Robert wanted: to gamble occasionally without being profiled as someone worth pursuing for higher value play. Now, before I reveal tactic number 3, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments. Do you use a player's card when you gamble? Or do you play anonymously? The next tactics get even more specific about what former employees say casinos really don't want you doing. And tactic number 5 is something that allegedly got employees written up for not reporting it. But first, let's talk about tactic number 3, the denomination downshift. Former slot technicians reveal a tactic casinos specifically warn floor staff about, and it's something that reportedly appears in internal memos across multiple major casino chains. They call it denomination downshifting, and according to these former employees, casino management tracks players who exhibit this behavior with remarkable attention. Here's how it works and why former insiders say it's so effective. Players who use this tactic start their sessions at higher denomination machines, quarters or dollars, but then deliberately move to penny slots after they hit predetermined loss limits. The psychology behind this approach, according to former floor managers, is fundamentally different from what casinos want players to do. Most gamblers, when they start losing, either leave entirely or chase their losses with larger bets. But players using the downshift method do something else entirely. They stay in action, they continue gambling, but they drastically reduce their expected loss per hour by moving to much lower denomination machines. Let's talk about the actual mathematics here, because this is where the tactic reveals its power. According to former slot technicians who described theoretical hold percentages and average spin rates, a player betting $1 per spin at a typical slot machine, spinning approximately 600 times per hour, faces an expected loss of roughly $90 to $120 per hour, depending on the specific machine's hold percentage. That same player moving to penny denomination machines and betting 40 or 50 cents per spin at the same spin rate faces an expected loss of approximately $20 to $30 per hour. The reduction is dramatic, somewhere between 70 and 80% less expected loss for what feels like similar action. The spinning, the sounds, the visual stimulation, all of that remains essentially the same, but the financial exposure drops precipitously. Former employees remember a player named David, who became something of an informal legend among staff at a downtown Las Vegas property. According to a former floor manager who worked there for 6 years, David visited every Saturday morning for the entire duration of this employee's tenure. His pattern never varied. David would arrive around 9 in the morning, play dollar denomination video poker for approximately 1 hour, then move to penny slots for the remainder of his visit. The former floor manager described how staff members eventually started referring to David by a nickname related to this behavior pattern, not maliciously, but as a recognition that his approach was notably different from typical players. The floor manager estimated that David's average session length was 3 to 4 hours total, but his expected theoretical loss was roughly equivalent to a player who spent just 1 hour at the dollar machines. The downshift, according to this former employee, effectively extended David's entertainment time by 300 to 400%, while keeping his total expected loss nearly constant. But casinos, according to former employees, don't just passively observe this behavior. They've implemented specific countermeasures based on the recognition that denomination downshifting reduces player profitability. The most obvious is floor design. According to former slot managers, high denomination machines are deliberately placed near entrances, in highly visible locations with better lighting and more comfortable seating. Penny slots, conversely, are typically positioned in back corners, in areas with less traffic and often less appealing environmental conditions. The strategic placement is designed to make the upward denomination journey easy and inviting, while making the downward journey feel like you're leaving the main action. One former slot director described this explicitly during an interview. The goal was creating a psychological environment where moving up in denomination felt like entering the premium area, while moving down felt like retreating to the budget section. Here's where it gets even more calculated. Former employees report being taught specific intervention tactics for players exhibiting downshift behavior. Floor managers would coordinate with casino hosts and cocktail servers to offer meal comps to players right around the moment they might typically downshift. If a player had been at dollar machines for 45 minutes to an hour and showed signs of preparing to move, staff members were reportedly trained to approach with comp offers that required immediate redemption. The pitch, according to a former floor manager, went something like this. We've noticed you've been playing, and we'd love to offer you lunch at the steakhouse. Your seat is ready right now. The timing was critical. The offer came with implicit urgency. Your table is ready now, which created pressure to make an immediate decision. If the player accepted and left the floor for a meal, they were removed from the gaming environment entirely during what would have been their downshift period. And according to former employees, players who took these meal breaks frequently never returned to the floor that day. Or if they did, they often returned to the higher denomination machines, rather than completing the downshift they'd been planning. One former casino host described the language employees were specifically trained to use during these interventions. The phrase she remembered most clearly was, "Don't want to lose your momentum." Staff would approach players who appeared ready to downshift with comments like, "You're doing great. You don't want to lose your momentum now. There's a hot machine in the high limit area that just reset." According to this former host, the psychological manipulation was built into the scripted language. Momentum was a deliberately chosen word because it implied that something positive was happening, something that would be lost by changing behavior. The suggestion about hot machines or recent payouts created a sense of opportunity that required staying at higher denominations, and the reference to high limit areas positioned upward movement as the natural, logical next step rather than downward denomination movement. Here's something a former slot manager revealed that speaks to how effective denomination downshifting actually is. He described an internal analysis his property conducted around 2018 or 19, examining player behavior patterns and their correlation with theoretical win. According to this former manager, the analysis identified players who consistently used denomination downshift tactics, and the findings were striking enough that they were presented in a regional management meeting. The simple act of downshifting after losses, this former manager said, probably cost us more in lost theoretical than any card counting strategy or advantage play technique. That's a remarkable statement. Casino management, according to this insider, viewed denomination downshifting as more financially impactful than actual advantage play. And here's the dark irony that multiple former employees mentioned. This tactic is completely legal, requires no special skill or knowledge, and is available to literally any player at any time. Yet, according to these former workers, almost nobody does it consistently. Several former floor managers independently described how unusual it was to encounter players who deliberately and consistently downshifted. One estimated she saw this behavior maybe once or twice per shift in a casino with thousands of daily visitors. The discipline required, according to these former employees, was simply too difficult for most players to maintain. The psychological pull to stay at higher denominations, to chase losses with bigger bets, to maintain the same level of action when winning or losing, was apparently too strong for the vast majority of gamblers to resist. And that's exactly what casinos count on. But here's where it gets really interesting, because tactic number 4 takes discipline to an entirely different level. This next one is something a former casino host said she witnessed maybe 5 times in 10 years working on the floor. The rarity factor alone, according to former employees from multiple properties, makes this tactic notable. But what makes it truly effective is how completely it changes the financial dynamic of gambling. Former pit bosses describe this as the most disciplined thing they ever witnessed on a casino floor. It's called session bankroll separation, And what one former floor manager told us about this tactic reveals exactly why casinos have worked so hard to make it difficult to execute. Here's what makes session bankroll separation so powerful and why former casino employees say they saw this behavior so rarely. The tactic involves bringing exactly the amount of money you intend to lose in physical cash and leaving everything else behind. No credit cards in your wallet, no debit cards, no ability to access additional funds whatsoever. According to former pit bosses and casino hosts, this physical separation creates a barrier that mental accounting simply cannot match. One former host described a player she encountered during her third year working at a Reno property, and even 15 years later, she remembered him clearly. His name was James, and what made him unforgettable to casino staff wasn't anything dramatic or unusual about his gambling itself. It was his envelopes. James would arrive at the casino carrying a small shoulder bag, and inside that bag were envelopes. According to the former host who observed him multiple times, each envelope was labeled with a session number and contained exactly $200 and $20 bills. James would sit at a blackjack table, remove one envelope, and place it in his left jacket pocket. The empty envelope went into his right jacket pocket. As he won hands, chips went into the right pocket with the empty envelope. As he lost hands, he pulled cash from the left pocket. Former dealers who worked his table reported that James never mixed the money. Winnings always went to the right. Starting bankroll always came from the left. And here's the critical part that former employees emphasized. When the left pocket was empty, when that $200 was gone, James would stand up and leave the table immediately. No hesitation, no negotiation with himself, no just one more hand. The session was over. According to the former casino host who knew him, James typically played 3 sessions during a visit, sometimes 4. Each session with its own envelope, each envelope with exactly $200. If he won during a session, those chips stayed completely separate. Former employees reported that James would often cash out between sessions, take his winning chips to the cage, get cash, and that cash went into a completely different pocket that he never touched for gambling. One former dealer described watching James have a particularly good session where he won approximately $900. The dealer expected James to press his bets, to ride the hot streak, to do what almost every other winning player did. Instead, James colored up his chips, stood from the table, walked to the cashier cage, and left the building. The former dealer remembered asking a pit supervisor about it. The supervisor's response was simple. That guy knows something 99% of our players don't know. What James understood, according to former employees who witnessed this behavior pattern, was that physical separation works in ways that mental accounting cannot. There's extensive casino industry discussion about why players consistently fail at setting loss limits, even when they genuinely intend to follow them. Former casino hosts described the phenomenon they observed thousands of times. A player decides they'll only lose $300. They lose the $300. And then, according to these former employees, something happens. The player tells themselves they'll just get 300 more, just to get back to even. Or they convince themselves that 300 wasn't really a fair test. They need a bit more to really give themselves a chance. Or they remember they have dinner plans later anyway, so they might as well get some cash for that now and use it to play a little longer. The rationalizations, according to former casino hosts, were infinite in their variety but identical in their outcome. Players who relied on mental limits almost always exceeded them. But James, with his physical envelope system, had removed the possibility of rationalization. When the envelope was empty, there was no more money available to gamble with. According to former employees, this physical barrier was almost impossible to overcome in the moment. James would have needed to leave the casino, go to his hotel room or his car, retrieve his wallet, return to the casino, find an ATM, or go to the cage for a credit advance, and then return to gambling. That series of steps, that physical journey, that cooling off period, was apparently enough to prevent the impulsive decision to exceed his limits. One former pit boss estimated that this simple physical separation reduced James's average loss per visit by 40 to 60%, compared to similar players who kept their credit cards and debit cards accessible. Here's where casino countermeasures become really revealing about how effective this tactic actually is. Former employees describe specific training related to players who exhibit this kind of extreme bankroll discipline. The first countermeasure is environmental. According to a former credit office employee, ATM machines are deliberately positioned near high traffic gaming areas. The placement isn't accidental or convenient, it's strategic. Former casino managers explained that ATMs near the gaming floor reduce the friction, reduce the cooling off period, reduce the number of steps between deciding to get more money and actually having that money available to gamble. The easier casinos make it to access additional funds, the less effective physical separation becomes. But James's tactic went further than most players. By leaving his access cards in his hotel room entirely, he'd created maximum friction, maximum cooling off period, maximum number of steps between impulse and action. The second countermeasure former employees described involves direct intervention. Casino hosts and floor managers are reportedly trained to identify players using envelope systems or other visible bankroll separation methods. When staff members observe this behavior, according to a former casino host, they're taught to offer what she called liquidity services. The pitch goes something like this: "We've noticed you're a valued player, and we want to make sure your experience is convenient. We can set up a casino credit line for you so you never have to worry about running out of cash during your visit." According to this former host, the offer was always framed as a customer service enhancement, a convenience, a VIP amenity. But the actual goal, she admitted, was removing the barrier that physical cash limits created. A player with casino credit doesn't need envelopes. They can just sign a marker. And that signature, according to former employees, happens much more easily than a physical trip to retrieve a wallet would. There's a specific time window that former employees said was critical for these interventions. Between 8 and 9 in the evening, according to a former floor manager, was when players most frequently returned to their hotel rooms, presumably to get additional money after exhausting their initial bankroll. Casino hosts were reportedly taught to monitor for players who exhibited signs of session ending around this time period. If a player who'd been gambling for several hours suddenly stood up, cashed out, and walked toward the exit around 8:30, hosts were trained to intercept with offers designed to keep them in the building. Tournament entries, show tickets, dining comps, anything that prevented the player from leaving the property and potentially not returning. And here's the really calculated part. According to a former casino host, cocktail service was deliberately increased during this time window. The free drinks, she explained, weren't just about hospitality. They were about creating mild intoxication that reduced discipline and made the trip back to the hotel room for more money feel more acceptable, more reasonable, more justified. Former employees estimated that players using true physical separation tactics, players like James with his envelope system, were extraordinarily rare. One former pit boss said he could count on two hands the number of players he encountered in 15 years who consistently used this approach. And every single one of them, according to this former employee, was almost impossible to convert to higher value play. Casino hosts would try. They'd offer better comps, higher tier status, invitations to special events. But players with this level of discipline, this former pit boss said, were essentially immune to the psychological tactics that worked on everyone else. They'd decided what they were willing to lose before they ever walked in. They'd created physical barriers to changing that decision in the moment, and no amount of persuasion or inducement could alter their behavior. That resistance, according to multiple former employees, is exactly what makes this tactic so effective. It's also exactly what makes it so incredibly rare. But wait until you hear about tactic number 5, because this one is so controversial that this one is so effective that several former employees said they were specifically trained to watch for it. And according to internal communications that former managers described, properties actually documented instances of this behavior in shift reports. Tactic number 5, the team loss limit agreement. Former floor managers report that groups who enforce each other's limits are, from a casino revenue perspective, the worst possible customers. Here's why this tactic works and why casinos have invested considerable training resources in trying to counteract it. Players who come to casinos in groups and designate one person as an enforcer, someone who monitors everyone's time and losses and has the authority to end sessions, create an external accountability structure that individual willpower simply cannot match. According to former pit supervisors, this behavior pattern is rare enough that when it appears, it gets noticed and discussed in manager meetings. The structure is straightforward but remarkably effective. A group of 3 to 5 friends decides before they ever arrive at the casino that one person will not gamble. That person's role is purely observational. They track how long each friend has been playing, approximately how much each person has lost, and when predetermined limits are reached, they intervene. Former employees describe watching these dynamics play out, and what made the tactic so effective was the social pressure component. It's one thing to break a promise you made to yourself in private. It's entirely different to break a promise in front of friends who are watching specifically to hold you accountable. One former floor manager remembered a group of women, teachers from somewhere in Southern California, who visited a Laughlin property 4 times a year for over a decade. According to this former employee, casino management actually discussed this group in quarterly revenue meetings because their spending pattern was so far below average for their demographic and visit frequency. The teachers would arrive, usually 6 or 7 of them, and one woman never gambled at all. She would walk the floor with the group, sit near them while they played, have drinks and conversation, but she never put a single dollar into a machine or onto a table. Former slot attendants reported that this woman carried a small notebook, and she would occasionally write things down. After several visits, a curious casino host finally asked her what she was tracking. According to the former host who shared this story, the woman explained their system completely openly. Each teacher had agreed to a 3-hour time limit and a $400 loss limit, whichever came first. The notebook tracked start times and approximate losses based on what each person reported. When someone hit either limit, the designated enforcer would walk over and say something simple like, "Okay, time's up," or "You hit your number, let's go get dinner." And here's what former employees found remarkable. It worked every single time they witnessed it. Not once, according to multiple former staff members who observed this group over years, did any of the teachers argue or resist when the enforcer intervened. The social agreement, the external accountability, the presence of friends watching, it created a framework that individual discipline alone apparently could not maintain. Former pit bosses described one specific incident that revealed just how powerful this tactic could be. A member of the teachers group was playing video poker, and according to a former floor manager who witnessed this, the woman had just been dealt 4 cards to a royal flush. For non-poker players, that's an incredibly rare and valuable situation. The woman drew her 5th card, missed the royal flush, but still won approximately $800 on the hand. She was celebrating, clearly excited, and appeared ready to continue playing. At that exact moment, according to this former employee, the enforcer approached and said, "It's been 3 hours. We agreed we'd stop at 3 hours." The woman actually gestured at her chips, at the machine, clearly wanting to articulate that she was winning, that this was different from the typical situation. But the enforcer simply repeated, "3 hours, that was the agreement." And the woman, after a long pause that the former floor manager described as visibly uncomfortable, cashed out and left with her group. That moment, the former manager said, perfectly encapsulated why casinos found this tactic so problematic. Even in a situation where a player was winning, where every psychological impulse would encourage continued play, the external accountability structure was strong enough to enforce the predetermined limit. Now, here's where casino countermeasures become almost comically transparent about the industry's priorities. Former cocktail servers report being specifically trained to offer the designated enforcer free drinks. The reasoning, according to a former bar manager, was straightforward. If you could compromise the enforcer's judgment even slightly, if you could introduce enough alcohol to reduce their vigilance or their willingness to enforce limits strictly, the entire group's discipline structure would collapse. One former server remembered being told explicitly during training, The person who's not gambling is actually the most important person to serve. Former casino hosts describe similar tactics. They would approach groups exhibiting this behavior pattern and offer comps that separated the group. One person gets a tournament entry, another gets a spa appointment, someone else gets priority seating at a show, but at different time slots. The goal, according to a former host, was disrupting the group cohesion. If you could get the enforcer away from the floor, even for 30 minutes, that was 30 minutes where the other players had no external accountability, and 30 minutes, according to former floor managers, was often enough for a disciplined player to abandon their limits and extend their session significantly. There's a darker countermeasure that multiple former employees described with obvious discomfort. Casino hosts would sometimes offer what they called individual benefits to players in these groups. A free room upgrade, but only for one person, not the whole group. A line pass to a popular nightclub, but just for two people. High value comps that couldn't be shared, that created potential resentment within the group structure. One former host admitted that the strategy was to introduce friction into the group dynamic, to make the enforcer seem like an obstacle to benefits rather than a helpful accountability partner. If we could make the enforcer feel like the bad guy, she said, the system usually fell apart within a visit or two. The former employees who shared these tactics all expressed some level of regret or discomfort about them. One former floor manager said directly, "These were people doing something genuinely smart and healthy, and we were trained to undermine it." Former surveillance operators report that groups using enforcer systems were sometimes tracked more carefully than typical players, not because they were doing anything wrong or suspicious, but because they represented lost revenue potential. The surveillance notes weren't about cheating concerns. They were about identifying which member was the enforcer, what the group's patterns were, when they typically arrived and departed, what might be effective intervention strategies. One former surveillance employee described finding these notes in the system and feeling genuinely disturbed by them. "We were treating people like targets," he said, "just because they were trying to gamble responsibly." The fact that casinos devoted this much attention, this much training, and this many specific countermeasure strategies to something as simple as friends helping friends stick to predetermined limits, that tells you exactly how effective the tactic actually is. And now for tactic number 6, because this one reveals something fundamental about why most players lose more than they intend to. You might think setting a win goal sounds obvious, and according to former casino employees, almost every player claims they do it. But here's what makes tactic number 6 different, and here's why former cage workers say they could identify the tiny fraction of players who actually executed this strategy versus the overwhelming majority who just talked about it. The critical distinction isn't setting a goal. It's having a specific, immediate, irreversible plan for your winnings the moment you reach that goal. Former Cage employees report that they would see the same small group of disciplined players follow an identical pattern: win a predetermined amount, immediately cash out, get a check instead of cash, and leave the property within minutes. Not leave the table. Not leave the gaming floor. Leave the building entirely. There was a player named Patricia who worked as a regular customer at a station casino property for years, and a former cashier remembered her so clearly that she could describe Patricia's exact routine more than a decade later. Patricia would arrive with $1,000 in cash. She played slot machines, typically video poker, for what former slot attendants estimated was usually between 60 and 90 minutes. If Patricia won $300, if her balance reached exactly $1,300 total, she would immediately cash out. Not gradually, not after one more spin. Immediately. She would walk directly to the cashier cage with her ticket, and here's the detail that former cage workers said made all the difference. Patricia would specifically request a check, not cash. The former cashier explained why this mattered. A check requires you to either deposit it at a bank or cash it somewhere else. It creates separation between the winning and the ability to immediately put that money back into action. Patricia would receive her check, place it in her purse, and according to multiple former employees who witnessed this pattern repeatedly, she would walk straight to the parking garage and leave. The former cashier estimated Patricia's average time in the casino at maybe 90 minutes total. Now, former casino hosts and floor managers were acutely aware of Patricia. According to a former host who worked at the same property, Patricia's player profile was discussed specifically in training sessions as an example of a player who needed intervention. Not because she was doing anything wrong, because her behavior represented minimal revenue generation. When Patricia won, she left. When she lost her initial $1,000, she also left. There was no extended play, no chasing losses, no reinvesting wins, none of the behaviors that casinos depend on for profitability. Former employees estimated that Patricia's average annual theoretical loss was somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, which sounds significant until you compare it to typical slot players at her denomination level who averaged $15,000 to $25,000 in annual theoretical loss. Patricia was leaving approximately $20,000 per year on the table from a casino revenue perspective, simply by leaving when she said she would. The casino countermeasures aimed at players like Patricia reveal exactly how threatened properties are by this behavior. Former cage supervisors describe specific training they received about players attempting to leave after wins. The scripting was deliberate and psychologically calculated. When a player asked for a check after a winning session, cage employees were taught to say things like, "Don't you want to try your luck while it's running hot?" Or "We just had someone hit a jackpot on that same game you were playing." Or "If you wait about 20 minutes, there's a drawing you're qualified for." Every phrase was designed to introduce delay, to create a reason to stay, to interrupt the immediate departure that made Patricia's tactics so effective. One former cage supervisor remembered the exact language from training materials. "Our goal is to extend the visit by any means necessary. If we can keep a winning player on property for even 30 additional minutes, historical data shows they'll put a significant percentage of their winnings back into action." There's a psychological manipulation embedded in casino cage operations that former employees described with obvious discomfort. Cashing out chips is deliberately made more complicated than getting additional money. If you want to access your credit line, if you want to get a marker, if you want to use an ATM, all of those processes are streamlined and fast. Former credit office employees said they were evaluated based on how quickly they could process marker requests. But cashing out, particularly cashing out for checks instead of cash, involves more paperwork, more questions, more steps. One former cage worker admitted the inefficiency was intentional. Anything that added friction to the cash out process, anything that made leaving slightly more difficult, was considered beneficial from a revenue perspective. The contrast was stark. Money flowing into the casino moved through greased channels, while money flowing out encountered bureaucratic resistance at every step. Here's what makes Patricia's tactics so remarkable, according to former employees. She represents maybe 2 or 3% of players who hit win goals. The other 97 or 98%, according to former pit bosses and cage workers, would hit their target, feel good about it, decide they could risk just a little bit of their winnings, and be back at a machine or table within minutes. Former floor managers report watching this cycle countless times every single shift. A player wins $400 or $500, cashes out, walks around the casino, convinces themselves that maybe they should try a different game, and within an hour has given back most or all of their winnings. One former pit boss said he could predict with remarkable accuracy which winning players would return to action. The ones who stayed on property, who went to restaurants or shows or just walked around, almost always came back. The ones who immediately left the building rarely returned the same day. There's a former casino manager who shared something that cuts to the core of why tactic number 6 works. He said that in 23 years working in casinos across multiple properties in 3 different states, he could count on both hands the number of players he witnessed who consistently left immediately after reaching modest win goals. Not occasional wins, consistent execution of the strategy. And every single one of those players, he said, was in his observation the only people who left casinos as long-term winners. Not because they won more often, not because they got luckier, but because they had the discipline to leave with their winnings, while the overwhelming majority of other players stayed until those winnings evaporated. The mathematical house edge this former manager explained needs time to assert itself. If you remove yourself from exposure quickly enough, particularly when you're ahead, the edge doesn't have the opportunity to reclaim your temporary variance-driven wins. This simple tactic, actually leaving when you said you would, is apparently the rarest behavior former employees ever witnessed on casino floors. And speaking of rare behaviors that casinos have actually changed policies to prevent, tactic number 7 is something that reportedly led multiple properties to restructure their entire comp systems. So there you have it. 7 tactics that former casino employees say actually work for minimizing losses. And if you look at them collectively, something remarkable emerges that multiple former insiders pointed out independently. Every single one of these tactics, from time limits to team enforcers to immediate departures after wins, does essentially the same thing. They limit exposure. They reduce the amount of time that the house edge has to work against your bankroll. Former pit bosses and floor managers emphasize this point repeatedly during conversations. The house edge itself never changes. A slot machine programmed at 88% return to player maintains that exact percentage whether you play for 30 minutes or 8 hours. A blackjack table with standard rules offers the same mathematical advantage to the casino, regardless of how long you sit there. What changes, according to these former employees, is how much opportunity that edge has to extract money from you. One former pit boss used an analogy that multiple other former workers echoed in various forms. He said the house edge is like a slow leak in your tire, and these tactics essentially limit how long you're driving on it. You're not fixing the leak. The mathematical disadvantage still exists, but you're reducing your exposure to it dramatically. Former employees described specific casino design elements that all work toward the same goal: maximizing your time on device, maximizing your exposure to the house edge. The absence of clocks and windows isn't accidental. The maze-like layouts that make finding exits difficult aren't coincidental. The strategic placement of bathrooms deep inside the gaming floor, requiring you to walk past hundreds of machines to reach them, represents deliberate design. Former floor managers described how even the placement of chairs and the ambient temperature are calibrated to encourage extended play. Everything in the casino environment pushes toward longer sessions, more hands, more spins, more exposure. And every one of these 7 tactics represents what former employees called a workaround, a way to counteract that environmental manipulation through pure discipline. Here's something that former surveillance operators revealed that speaks to how seriously casinos take these tactics. Players who exhibited consistent discipline, who used time limits or bankroll separation or immediate post-win departures, were sometimes tracked more carefully than card counters. Not because they were cheating, not because they were doing anything illegal or even unethical, but because they represented what one former surveillance employee called lost revenue potential. The surveillance notes weren't about game protection. They were about identifying patterns that casino marketing and player development could use to try converting these disciplined players into higher value, longer duration customers. Former employees described seeing player profiles that detailed exactly which tactics a person used, how consistently they used them, what interventions had been attempted, and what the success rate of those interventions had been. The level of attention devoted to tracking and attempting to modify legal, disciplined behavior was something multiple former workers said disturbed them once they recognized the pattern. Former casino marketing employees explained that comp systems are specifically designed to reward behaviors casinos want and discourage behaviors they don't want. Extended play gets rewarded, frequent visits get rewarded, high average bets get rewarded, but brief sessions, infrequent visits, and variable betting patterns result in minimal comps and no host attention. The system isn't neutral. It's engineered to incentivize exactly the kind of play that maximizes casino profitability and, by extension, maximizes player losses. One former player development director said something that multiple other former employees echoed. Every system we built assumed players would lack discipline, and the few who had it broke all our models. Casinos spend millions on psychological research, on environmental design, on training employees to encourage specific behaviors. And all of it, according to these former insiders, falls apart when confronted with simple discipline. A player who sets a time limit and leaves. A player who physically separates their bankroll and can't access more. A player who reaches a modest win goal and immediately walks out. These behaviors aren't sophisticated. They don't require special knowledge or complex strategies. They're almost absurdly simple. And yet former employees say fewer than 5% of players actually execute them consistently. Several former workers talked about why they eventually left the industry, and a common theme emerged in these conversations. They described reaching a point where they could no longer ignore what they were observing. One former casino host said she started her career believing she worked in entertainment, providing people with fun experiences and occasional wins. But over time, she said, she realized the business model didn't depend on entertainment value. It depended on players lacking discipline, on extended sessions, on chasing losses, on giving back wins. Another former floor manager described watching the same players week after week, year after year, exhibiting the exact behaviors that casinos encouraged and losing amounts that clearly exceeded entertainment budgets. These weren't problem gamblers in the clinical sense, he said. They were just regular people who lacked the discipline to execute the simple tactics that actually work. And we were trained to make sure they never developed that discipline. Now, here's what no former employee wanted anyone to forget, and this came up in every single conversation. None of these tactics eliminate the house edge. None of them turn negative expectation games into positive expectation opportunities. None of them guarantee you'll win or even that you'll lose less on any particular visit. The mathematics are immutable. Over sufficient time and volume, the house edge will assert itself, and you will lose. The best strategy, strategy that every former employee endorsed without exception, is not playing at all. But if you do choose to gamble, these tactics represent the most effective methods former insiders observed for treating it as entertainment rather than income opportunity. The question you should ask yourself, according to a former casino host, is how much am I willing to pay for this many hours of entertainment? That framing, she said, changes everything. You're not trying to win money. You're not trying to get even. You're paying for an experience the same way you'd pay for concert tickets or a movie or a nice dinner. And these tactics help ensure you don't pay dramatically more than you intended. Former employees also emphasized watching for signs that gambling has moved beyond entertainment into something more concerning. Playing to get even rather than for enjoyment. Gambling with money needed for necessities. Lying to family members about losses. Chasing losses with credit or borrowed money. Emotional distress during or after gambling sessions. Any of these patterns, according to former workers who witnessed them constantly, indicate that professional help might be appropriate. Multiple former employees mentioned that problem gambling resources exist and that reaching out isn't a sign of weakness but of self-awareness. The line between entertainment and addiction, several former insiders said, can be subtle, and crossing it can happen gradually enough that you don't recognize it until significant damage has occurred. So now you know what former casino employees say actually works for minimizing losses. You have insider information that casinos have spent considerable resources trying to counteract through training, environmental design, and comp system restructuring. The common thread connecting all 7 tactics is discipline and planning. Knowing these tactics versus actually implementing them, former employees emphasized, represents the real test. It's one thing to intellectually understand that setting a time limit works. It's entirely different to actually stand up and leave when your alarm rings, especially if you're winning, especially if you're in the middle of what feels like a hot streak, especially when every environmental cue is encouraging you to stay just a little longer. I'd love to hear from you about whether you've used any of these tactics or seen other players using them. Let me know in the comments which one you think is most effective, or share your own observations about disciplined versus undisciplined gambling behavior. If you found this information valuable, if these insights from former casino insiders helped you understand how to approach gambling more strategically, please subscribe to this channel. We'll be revealing more insider casino information in future videos, including what former dealers say about specific table games and the tactics smart players use at blackjack and craps tables. And trust me, what they shared about table game tactics is going to surprise you. Thanks for watching.